Welcome to the Box Office Babbler. This was the first video I made, but the sound wasn't good because I used the wrong microphone, and I never published it. I decided on a movie channel while watching Dave near the end of the 2024 presidential campaign. This movie came out during my first winter in Alaska when I was a new airman in the US Air Force. I saw it with my wife shortly after we found out we were expecting our first child. The comment I heard from my friends is how unfortunate it is that we don't have many men like Dave Kovich in politics. I think it's still true. Even though the original recording was never published, I learned a lot through the process. During that time, Donald Trump was officially elected to another term. I thought the topic was timely, and I think it still remains so. Released in May 1993 by Warner Brothers, Dave was directed by Ivan Reitman, who also directed Meatballs, Stripes, Ghostbusters, and Twins. It stars Kevin Kline, Sigourney Weaver, Frank Langella, Kevin Dunn, Ving Rhames, Ben Kingsley, and Laura Linney. It was a moderate hit, grossing about $92 million at the box office, which wasn't bad for a late spring film in the early 1990s. The president, Bill Mitchell, portrayed by Kevin Kline, hires a look-alike named Dave Kovich, also played by Kline, to impersonate him after a fundraising speech. While Kovich is impersonating the president, just walking from the hotel to the presidential limousine, the real president is in a hotel room upstairs having an illicit liaison with a staffer. During their tryst, the president suffers a massive stroke and goes into a coma. As a side note, this film was released in 1993, too early for it to be about the sitting president at that time, Bill Clinton. Even before Lewinsky Gate, Clinton had that kind of a reputation. Movies, however, take a long time to be made. Gary Ross began writing Dave in 1988, when Ronald Reagan was still the president. Back to the movie. The chief of staff, Bob Alexander, played by Frank Langella, thinks he can twist the situation to his advantage. He wants to have Kovich continue to portray the president long enough to frame the vice president, Gary Nance, portrayed by Kingsley, for a crime actually committed by Mitchell, forcing the vice president to resign. Kovich, then portraying the president, would appoint Alexander to be the new vice president. At that point, it would be revealed that the president is in a coma. Alexander would be the legitimate acting president. Kovich would be able to return to his business, running an employment agency. The conspiracy appears to go on as planned until the First Lady, portrayed by Weaver, catches on. After she sees her estranged husband in a secret White House basement hospital, Ellen and Dave attempt to run away from the whole mess, but then decide they can do some good by continuing the charade. Alexander is then fired. After getting the boot, Alexander attempts to expose the plot that he wanted to frame the vice president for, but to do so in a way that makes him look like the hero. This is when Ellen Mitchell, Dave Kovich, and communication director Alan Reed decide that the charade must end. Kovich exposes the crimes of Mitchell and Alexander, even providing proof before a joint session of Congress, and then pretends to pass out. Kovich returns to a small business. Ellen continues her good work as First Lady until her husband passes. Nance becomes the acting president, then being sworn in once Mitchell passes. Ellen and Dave then become a couple in a typical Hollywood ending. A major talking point in the film is the 25th Amendment. Let's discuss the 25th Amendment and how it came to be. When the Constitution was first written, it was not clear about how vacancies to the presidency or the vice presidency were filled. There were times when the vice president passed away or resigned, but the office was left vacant until the next election. George Clinton, who was the fourth vice president, died in office, and the vice presidency was vacant for the remainder of James Madison's first term. This was a period of 11 months. This became the precedent and remained the policy of the United States until the passage of the 25th Amendment. The issue of when to replace a president came to a head when President William Henry Harrison died only 31 days into his term. It had been discussed that the vice president would become the acting president if the president had passed away, but it wasn't exactly codified into law. Tyler asserted that he was not just the acting president, but the actual president, which would eventually be honored. The precedent established by Tyler became the custom. It was honored when Zachary Taylor, Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, Warren Harding, Franklin Roosevelt, and John F. Kennedy passed away in office. There were laws passed by Congress and other amendments to the Constitution that honored this precedent. The 22nd Amendment implies that the vice president becomes the president, but it does not explicitly say so. Before the passage of the 25th Amendment, the vice presidency was vacant 16 times. 8 times when the vice president assumed the office of president due to the death of the president, 7 times due to the death of the vice president, and once due to the resignation of the vice president. There have been times when the president was not able to fulfill his duties in office, but the details were kept secret from the public. We probably don't know about them all, but I will discuss 3 that history does know about. In 1893, during his second term in office, President Grover Cleveland had cancer surgery. At the time, the details were kept from the public. The press was given the cover that the president would be taking a vacation. On board a yacht, the operation was performed moving part of his upper left jaw and part of the soft palate. Cleveland was fitted with a prosthetic which would correct problems with his speech. The president was put under with nitrous oxide, and the surgery was performed through his open mouth to not leave any facial scars, just like when I had my wisdom teeth taken out. The operation would leave his face slightly disfigured for life, but was explained to the press as being caused by dental problems. The operation was a success, and Cleveland was able to finish his term and live long beyond the end of his presidency. Today, we're not certain that this surgery was necessary. Sure, the tumor may have been malignant, but these kind of mouth cancers sometimes have a low probability of metastasis. But if you think cancer is scary today, it was worse in 1893. It was almost certainly a death sentence, and the only treatment at the time was surgery. Either they removed the cancer with the surgery, or you would die. As the U.S. was in a recession in 1893, President Cleveland thought it was not a good time to alarm the public. He had just started his second term. He was probably right. It wasn't a good time to alarm the public. And the deaths of Lincoln and Garfield were still fresh in the minds of the public. I'm sure you've all heard about this one. In November 1918, the First World War ended with the Treaty of Paris, which was signed by the participants of the Western Front of the war. Our Constitution says that treaties need to be ratified by the Senate. At the time, our Senate was a little worried that joining the League of Nations would draw the United States into future European conflicts. They were not willing to commit to it. Woodrow Wilson went on a tour trying to drum up support for the treaty. In October 1919, while campaigning for the ratification of the treaty, President Woodrow Wilson suffered a stroke. He ended up bedridden for the rest of his life. The true extent of his disability was hidden from the public. He even tried to run for a third term. His wife, Edith Wilson, attended cabinet meetings in his stead for the remainder of his term. although she maintained in her memoirs that Wilson was the one who made all the executive decisions and signed all the bills himself. She was the one who determined what matters to bring to his attention. Some jokingly refer to Edith Wilson as the first female president. Let's fast forward to the 1950s and discuss the health of Dwight D. Eisenhower. For most of his adult life, he was a heavy smoker. In 1955, 3 years into his first term, he suffered a heart attack while vacationing in Colorado. It was initially diagnosed as indigestion, and this made matters worse. It took 6 weeks in the hospital for him to recover. During this time, Vice President Richard Nixon, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, who the airport is named after, and Chief of Staff Sherman Adams took care of administrative duties while communicating with the president. Again, all decisions were allegedly made by Ike himself. To improve the odds he would remain healthy, he decided to give up cigarettes. So did his wife. In spite of this, he had some more health problems early in his second term. Because of the initial misdiagnosis, Eisenhower would develop an aneurysm. He suffered a mild stroke in a cabinet meeting. There was no hiding this from the public, but fortunately it wasn't a serious one. Ike also suffered from Crohn's disease and had to have surgery to remove a bowel obstruction. But after clearing all these health hurdles, he had few problems during the rest of his time in office, thankfully. Just in case, Eisenhower, Nixon, and Attorney General William P. Rogers came up with a plan for Nixon to be the acting president in case Eisenhower became incapacitated. This would not have been legally binding and could have caused a constitutional crisis. Fortunately, it never happened. Eisenhower's health issues, though, were the genesis of the 25th Amendment. Amendments to the Constitution often take years even to get a vote in Congress. The first draft of an amendment to address the disability of the president came about in 1963, put together by Senator Kenneth Keating of New York. But disability of the president was all it covered. Even though it was endorsed by the American Bar Association, it didn't get a lot of support. Many felt that the proposed amendment gave too much power to Congress to determine whether or not a presidential disability existed. In the meantime, we had the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, which further underscored the need for such an amendment. The new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, had a heart attack 8 years before becoming the president, but appeared to be healthy ever since giving up cigarettes himself, at least for a time. The issue continued to be debated in the Senate and refined. Senator Keating was defeated in a re-election bid in 1964, but Senator Roman Erska of Nebraska continued to shepherd the effort. In 1965, a draft was proposed by Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana and Representative Emanuel Seller of New York. It laid out the conditions under which a president could be declared unfit for office and how the president could certify he was again healthy, mostly taking Congress out of the picture, leaving the determination to the vice president and the cabinet. The proposal received bipartisan support, and several drafts and votes later, the amendment was sent to the states for ratification in July of 1965. It was ratified by the requisite number of states in 1967 to become law. There are 4 articles to the 25th Amendment. The first article clarifies that the vice president is the one who will succeed the president in case of removal from office, resignation, or death. This was the precedent set by John Tyler when he took over after the death of William Henry Harrison, but it is now firmly constitutional. The second article addresses a vacancy in the vice presidency. It states that the president may submit to Congress a nominee for vice president, which is ratified by a majority vote in both the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. The third article states that the president can self-declare an inability. This is usually in anticipation of a planned medical procedure. The vice president is the acting president until the president submits that he or she no longer has the inability to serve. The fourth article states that if the president becomes disabled, the vice president and the majority of the cabinet can certify that the president is not fit for duty. If that disability no longer exists, the president can certify that he or she is fit. This also has a coup prevention device, where the president can state he is fit, and if the president and vice president are in disagreement, Congress then decides who is the president. The first invocation of the 25th Amendment happened shortly after its ratification. The first application had nothing to do with Watergate, but it happened when all that was going on. On October 10, 1973, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned due to tax evasion. President Nixon then appointed House Minority Leader Gerald Ford as Vice President, who was then approved by both houses of Congress. You may have heard that Ford was never elected as Vice President. This at best is half true. He was elected by Congress, but not the Electoral College. Less than a year later, in August 1974, President Richard Nixon resigned. Gerald Ford became president. After that, he pardoned Nixon. Then he appointed former New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller as vice president, and again, this was ratified by both houses of Congress. Article 3 of the 25th Amendment has been used 4 times. The first use happened on July 12, 1985. Ronald Reagan underwent a routine colonoscopy, but when a cancerous polyp was found in his colon, they immediately removed part of the colon where that was discovered. For 6 hours, George H.W. Bush was the acting president. The first use of Section 3 was also its longest use. In 2002 and again in 2007, George W. Bush transferred power to Vice President Dick Cheney while also undergoing a colonoscopy. Joe Biden did the same for his procedure in 2021. These last 3 times transferred power for less than 2 hours. For 2 hours in 2021, Vice President Kamala Harris was the first woman to hold presidential power. There was a time when either Article 3 or Article 4 should have been used, but were not. That was during the 1981 assassination attempt against Ronald Reagan. When he got to the hospital, he was coughing up blood, and the doctors didn't give him a chance to invoke Article 3. You can't blame them. They were trying to save his life. Article 4 should have been invoked also, but Vice President Bush was in a flight at the time and didn't hear about the incident until he had landed. I think the 25th Amendment is going to be invoked again sooner or later. After all, we keep electing older and older presidents. I hope and pray that when it is needed, those who have the authority will use it. Whether or not you like politics, Dave is a good film. It is well written and is one of Kevin Kline's better roles. It's a film that makes you think, even though the ending is far from realistic. Somebody who impersonates the president while he is unconscious for 3 weeks is not going to just walk away. Over the years, I've wondered how many pardons Kingsley's Nance is going to have to issue after the movie's over. But in Hollywood, they don't let reality get in the way of a good story. Enough about Dave. At this point, I have done the first 12 movies I originally set out to do. I've learned a lot in the process. Next time, I will comment on a film I have not yet seen, at least not until last weekend. Stay tuned for that announcement. After that movie, since Superman is coming again this summer, I'd like to take a look back upon the first Superman movie, 1978's Superman, the movie. Hope to see you then.